understand that if we put our teachers in a position, you're Florida, you're same situation. Your administration establishment wants Common Core, and the unions in Florida have stood behind it. Where do your teachers go if they oppose this? Nowhere. They can't. But in places where the unions are starting to crack, this is a Harvard University, Stanford University study on education. Only 46% of teachers now say they back the standards, compared to 76% 1 year ago. And what do you think is going to happen? 44 states in the union have not seen any Common Core testing yet. What do you think happens this year after those states get it? Because it was the testing that drove New York and Chicago and California, some California teachers' unions, to run away from it. They saw it firsthand. What do you think is going to happen when that testing hits in all those other states? What's going to happen to those numbers? This is Josh Katz. He is in Orange County, Florida, which is, what, about an hour from here? Okay. Here, Josh is a self-described progressive high school math teacher. He's doing exactly what I'm doing. He's traveling the country, warning moms and dads about Common Core. And again, liberal progressive, I want you to listen quickly to a short clip of his, because I think it helps crystallize what our problems with Common Core are.
Our toxic culture of education begins with a classic supervillain archetype. I focus on Syndrome from The Incredibles. The supervillain's plan is to unleash a doom onto the world that only the supervillain can stop, thus gaining all the desired power. Now, this is exactly what happened in education in the 1980s and before, and then culminated in No Child Left Behind. Private education companies realized they could use public education, a multi-billion-dollar industry, to create a nearly endless stream of taxpayer money. They channeled millions of dollars into lobbying efforts and focused on two words, rigor and accountability, and put everything into place. State statutes were passed, district rules were enforced, and then finally No Child Left Behind became the national standard. Don't get me wrong about politics. These efforts were underway long before they were passed, so both parties get to take full credit for their disastrous results, especially with Race to the Top. We somehow took the education system that produced the individuals who put a man on the moon with technology less powerful than the phone in my pocket and characterized that education system as a failure, using the word accountability. We only have one way to address accountability: standardized testing. So we implemented standardized testing. And then a 1983 publication called A Nation at Risk showed standardized tests proved schools were failing, teachers were failing, students were failing, and when everything is failing, guess what we need? New textbooks, new workbooks, new resources, new training, accountability systems, new schools, private schools, charter schools, and who is it that creates all of these things that all of a sudden we need? Our supervillain, private education companies. The only way to feed a business model in this toxic culture of education is to perpetuate a picture of failure. I would love to meet any education company that has a business model that is built upon long-term student success. There simply is no money in long-term student success. Now, how is it that we can believe that a standardized test is what accurately measures student achievement? How can we believe that it measures student growth? That moment when the student's light bulb is finally lit, aha. That moment when a student says, thank you for helping him graduate with a 2.0 GPA. How can we attach a number to that moment when a third grader finally has the ability to write his own name? Who, by the way, has been labeled a failure for himself, his teacher, and his school. Yet we crave education standardization. We believe we need these high-stakes tests because we eat up the misinformation provided by these companies and policies using a false validity of their testing results. Our testing culture begins in elementary school. Colleagues of mine work with third graders who suffer from anxiety from high-stakes testing. From a one-day, one-shot, 4-hour computer-based test, the future path of a student is set, an academic identity is established, and a message is delivered loud and clear: either you can or you can't make it. And no matter what the teacher tells the student about how good they are or what talents they have, if the student doesn't score well on that high-stakes test, the third graders know exactly what it means and begin to define themselves. And it's starting to happen now in kindergarten. So we continue this barrage of standardized tests, and the students continue failing, and the districts have to continue the next initiatives that can solve the problems. Who is it that manufactures these products? Who creates these solutions? Our supervillain. Private companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill, who operate off policy and legislation written by nonprofit organizations and lobbying groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. The Common Core will do even more damage because of its emphasis on high-stakes testing matched with its myopic standards that are disguised in critical thinking. I've seen my daughter's kindergarten and first grade assignments. This isn't critical thinking. This is developmentally inappropriate rote. You think they could fool me with this stuff? Any education reform that doesn't address high-stakes testing and the non-cognitive factors of true success like character and integrity is a complete waste of time, and it's killing our kids.
And it's killing our kids. Now, he's right about so many things, but I'd like to take one moment and tell you something I think he's wrong about. As a progressive liberal, he makes a classic liberal mistake. The supervillain, the villain that's more responsible than all the others, is the private capitalist company. Now, you just heard me blast this crony capitalism of people like Pearson, right? I have no use for it. But it's interesting that Mr. Katz can't recognize the fact that none of this would be in your schools if the federal government, the watchdog of public education, didn't let it. Do you honestly think that Pearson could be in your schools like this if the feds didn't want them there? Well, you've already seen. The feds are paying them millions of your dollars to be there. This gentleman is just up the street from you. You should consult with him on this, right? This is no right-wing guy. And a couple of things, I played it because a couple of things I want you to recognize. He's right. Absolutely, and I wanted to give him credit for it. He's right. From 1911 all the way through the 1970s, American schools were preeminent in the world. We put men on the moon, we educated kids to put men on the moon with less technology than you have in your stupid little cell phone. And we characterized that education system a failure. Who did that? The teachers didn't characterize it a failure. The students didn't suddenly start not knowing things. Your school districts and schools didn't do it. It was testing companies. And you know when it happened? Not surprisingly, I know you're going to be absolutely blown away to hear this. You know when this started? When we created the Department of Education.
Oh,
In the late 70s, right? The previous iteration of our current president, his doppelganger in the 70s, right? For 200 years in this country, we educated our kids at a very high level without a centralized Department of Education. And in the late 1970s, we created one, and what immediately happened? The Department of Ed had to justify its own existence, right? So they got, and the textbook, the publishing companies realized that all that money was being pumped, now that was all going to the schools, that local school districts were having, all that money now was being first pumped into the federal government at the Department of Ed. So the textbook companies realized that, hey, if we get our hands in that pie, that money will come to us. So the textbook companies like Pearson, they created tests that quote-unquote proved in the early 1980s that American schools sucked. And when you prove that, guess what happens? You throw out everything and you've got to buy all new textbooks. Yeah. We've been doing math the same way in the West for 2,500 years. It's given us Archimedes and Galileo and Newton and Einstein. And you know, if you know anything about math, you know, right, that from kindergarten through high school, nothing has changed mathematically. The numbers, the formulas, it's all the same. So what do we keep buying new math textbooks for? You know what you're doing? You're buying all this social engineering junk, all this diversity initiatives and multiculturalism, all this stuff that has nothing to do with adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. Remember, we're old enough to remember the new math, aren't we? Well, what is Common Core? But what did you do, invent the numbers again? And here we are with Common Core math, which is a complete reinvention of something that didn't need to be reinvented in the first place. But as Mr. Katz points out, if I'm right and math hasn't changed, certainly not at the high school down level in all these centuries, if that hasn't, millennia, if that hasn't happened, you buy one math textbook and it's good for 50 years. There's no success in student achievement. If you're Pearson Publishing, you sell that one textbook and then 50 years later you come back and say, okay, anybody want another book? And that doesn't cut it for these companies. Yep. So you've seen what's happened in the last 40 years? Interestingly, corresponding exactly to when American schools started to fail. It's the standardization that's failing them. It's the nationalization that's failing them. How many of you got kids or grandkids? All of you. Can you get your 2 daughters and your 5 grandkids, could you get them all to get the exact same marks in all single subject areas? Absolutely. Of course you can. And if you can't do it in your families where you have some control, how are you going to do it with 60 million American school kids? Let's do the math that your schools refuse to do. Right? Education. That's the other thing I want to say. All right, fine. If you don't have an education degree, you have to shut up about education. But who is it that's put us in this problem in the last 40 years? Isn't it PhDs in education? Right? In typical big government fashion, the same people who screwed it up are telling you, you have no right to talk about it or fix it. It's shocking. Math. We've been doing math the same way all these years, and now all of a sudden, we need all these different ways to do it. The supervillain, right? Remember my definition. It's an unholy alliance between an out-of-control federal government and a small group of crony capitalist companies. And the thing about this union, what do the companies get out of this? The companies get money, lots and lots of money. What does the federal government get out of this? Control. You get this, right? You remember back in the old Nazi days, in the 1930s, right? All those companies, the very small group of companies that were allowed to work with the government and get rich. Companies like Volkswagen, right? Like the various chemical companies that worked with them. No sooner did the feds, the nationalists, the socialists actually, the Nazis, no sooner did they consolidate their power than the private companies went away after colluding, right? And you saw this in Soviet Russia. It's the same thing again and again. And Katz is exactly right about that. It's a dangerous thing. And if you don't believe me, how about this right-winger? How about Bill Gates? The man himself. Go back to 2009 when he was putting the whole scheme together and paying for it. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well. How do you get around? How do you write that off? How do your educational administrators and your feckless politicians who support this, how do they come to grips with the fact that the man who's orchestrating this is telling you that once we get our tests, once we get our standards into your schools, and then we start testing nationally, we get to determine what's taught. He who controls the tests controls what goes on in the classrooms. Do you know Common Core has already begun the process of renaming your teachers? They're not called teachers in the brand new Common Core textbooks. They're called facilitators. Do you understand why, right? Because there will be no teachers in the future. Teaching means that you have independent agency to dictate where things go. Now it's all scripted. In Wisconsin, we actually have teachers teaching math and English who aren't told until 1 week before they teach what they will teach. And they're getting faxes from the Department of Education in Wisconsin schools saying, okay, next week here's your slate. Here's what you'll talk about. Detailed scripts from Washington telling them, next week when you teach, here's what you're going to teach and how you're going to do it. And that blows up myth number 8, doesn't it? We have state and local control. Do you see what this is? By design? It's the death of state and local control. And you know, let's talk about standards, because this is where a lot of conservative people get hung up. Well, we need standards. We've got them. We've always had them. Do you know that there have been 50 different academic studies done in the last 40 years? 50. That demonstrate conclusively there is no correlation, zero correlation between state and national standards and how your kids perform in the classroom? That's absolutely shocking. We have no data whatsoever. You can go ahead and set the highest standards you want in Florida or at the national level. It has not the slightest impact on how your kids do. Because what does a state standard have to do with what goes on in a particular classroom? State standards are just suggestions. All that matters is what your teachers are able to get your kids to do. And we are not allowing them to do it. That's why it's failing. Here's the latest one. This is the most comprehensive. This one was published just about 4 months ago. This is the Brookings Institute, right, which is a left-leaning think tank. And the last 30 minutes now you've seen, right? Every single piece of information I've given you has come from the left. I've been saying this for a year and a half. They're saying it now. Good, good. Because in our twisted little world, and I could have spent 5 hours showing you Christians and conservatives blasting this stuff with data and documentation. But somehow, in our culture, it just doesn't quite have the punch. Right? Put a D before your name. This is the Brown Center report, the most thorough, done about 4 months ago. And the Brookings Institute is not a conservative organization. Here's their summation. You can find their report online free. What effect will the Common Core have on national achievement? The analysis presented here says very little impact. The quality of Common Core standards is being hotly debated, but the quality of past curriculum standards is unrelated to student achievement. And the rigor of performance standards, how high you make them, is unrelated. Think about this. Let's do the math that the schools won't do. You want to get all your kids in every single class to a specific place. Ultimately, in order to get more kids on board, are you going to have to raise the standard or lower it? It's common sense. Even No Child Left Behind, the disaster, speaking of Bushes, that George Bush orchestrated, right? No Child Left Behind. Whatever standards they started with initially, they continually, over 12 years, had to lower them because kids can't read.